Hi there, once again to the Ivory Tower Collections, and I've done two other videos on this system so far. So if you kind of recognize what you're looking at here, this is a Colecovision. Yes, it's already disassembled, and I'm not going to cover disassembly in this video because I've already done it one other time. And in fact, if you want to see how to disassemble a Colecovision and tear it down and break it down to the point where I'm at here, I should have a banner or something up here in the upper corner pointing to up here maybe, for a link on how to disassemble the Colecovision. So what's the purpose of today's video? Well, it's going to be to install one of the ultimate video upgrades that you can to the Colecovision. Specifically, the upgrade we're going to apply today is called the TMS-RGB video upgrade. And based on what the name sounds like, it is exactly what it sounds like. It is a RGB video upgrade solution for the Colecovision and other compatible systems that use the TMS 9920A or 9929A graphics video processor. Now there's been other RGB, or at least one other RGB solution in the past, which worked pretty well, but it had a few issues that people have always had with it. But the TMS-RGB is available and widely available for now. And it's not too bad in installation. So that's what we're going to go through in this video. We're going to go through the installation process of adding in the TMS-RGB board itself. So let's check it out. So what do we need to be able to perform this upgrade on a Colecovision? Well, for starters, you're definitely going to need this little guy right here. This is the TMS-RGB board itself. It's not a very large board, but yeah, actually it's a very excellent design because it's actually designed to be soldered onto the bottom side of the TMS video processor chip itself, making the installation really much simpler than most other RGB solutions out there. But there may be some modification work required to the board depending on the connection type that you plan to use for your RGB connections. Now, this particular board that you see before you, I purchased this pre-assembled from Mobius Tech Strip, and I will have a link in the video description on where you can order these boards. Now, by default, the boards from Mobius Tech Strip will be configured for basically standard RGB SCART cable outputs, utilizing for the most part an 8-pin mini-DIN connection, or for use with something like the XRGB FrameMeister. However, in this particular installation, we're going to do it a little bit differently, and we're going to actually use one of these right here. This is a 9-pin mini-DIN that's commonly used and found on the Sega Genesis Model 2 systems, also used on the 32X. But one of the good things about using this is that it's also fairly easy to get cables that can utilize this connector port. And that's what we're going to do today, is we're going to be using that particular 9-pin mini-DIN connection for this RGB installation. However, to use the Genesis cables, or to use Genesis Model 2 style cables, we'll require some slight modification to the TMS-RGB board itself. We'll focus on that a little bit later. So besides the 9-pin mini-DIN, what else am I going to need? Well, you could, if you wanted to, just solder your wires directly to the pins on the top of this, but I've also got myself a little breakout board that fits on top of this real nicely that will make it a little more professional looking when I go to do the installation for this. It sits on top of it like that. What other tools will we need besides the board? Well, you're also going to need some length of wire, which, depending on how many connections that you're going to connect up to the board, will also depend on how much wire you actually need. One of the other advantages, and one of the reasons why I'm using the 9-pin mini-DIN, is that it also allows for a composite input. You may recall in a previous video that I did a composite modification on this Colecovision, and I specifically stated in the video that I wasn't going to show the AV out connections for it. The reason for that was because all along it was going to be receiving one of these RGB upgrades, and since it was going to be using one of these Megadrive Genesis Model 2 AV connectors, there's a composite line already built into this So we're just going to run the composite video wire that I already have installed from that composite modification upgrade board directly to this mini-DIN connector. Therefore, you can just use a standard set of red, yellow, and white AV out cables from a Megadrive 2 or Genesis Model 2 and still get composite as well as audio. And was the reason for why I didn't show the connections before. So yeah, you're going to need a length of wire. Now how much wire you need is going to depend on where you plan to install your connector, your AV out connector for RGB usage. In this particular case, I've got a strand here of approximately 12 inches or 1 foot of wire. And this is going to be plenty for what I'm doing today. In fact, it's going to be a little bit more than enough for how I'm planning to do this installation. But as far as how many wires you'll need to connect, that's really going to depend on the connections that you're going to require. So in addition to the wire, obviously you're going to need a good soldering iron because you will have to solder some smaller wires or the wires to the RGB board itself in addition to soldering the RGB board to the bottom of the Colecovision. And that might require that you should get yourself some liquid flux. Obviously get you some nice good solder that you're happy and comfortable with using. Other tools, you're definitely going to need yourself a good set of tweezers. Yes, because we're going to be working, or at least for the modifications I have to make on the TMS-RGB board, I'm going to need my tweezers to be able to hold on to some surface mount components that have to be removed. So if you're going to be going that route, make sure you got yourself a good set of tweezers, electrical tweezers. You're going to need that number 2 Phillips in order to take the Colecovision apart. Again, in this video I will already have it disassembled, but normally this would be required. And then basically any other tools and items you might think you require. You know, a good set of wire strippers, and some flush cutters here will probably be required and be needed just to trim up my wiring and make it all look nice and pretty afterwards. Always need my trusty toothbrush and some cleaning alcohol here to make sure I clean up my messes afterwards. So there's not going to be a ton of tools required for the most part, but anything else that I might end up using or that I think might be a good requirement, I will mention in the course of the video. Let's go ahead and start with the TMS-RGB board itself and what small modifications are needed to it. Here's the TMS-RGB board itself. Again, this is a pretty small board. I'm trying to see if I've got anything I can use as a comparison for you on the size of it, but it's basically about the same size as the video display processor chip. In fact, it is because it solders onto the pins on the bottom side of it. So it's got the same width and the same length. And it's got quite a few surface mount components on it. However, the modification that needs to be made for this in order for it to be compatible with Sega Genesis Model 2 type AV cables is that on the output pins here, especially on the red, green, and blue output lines, we have some very tiny 75 ohm surface mount resistors. Well, because most of the time these resistors already exist inside of Megadrive 2, Genesis 2 AV cables, we do not require these. So what I'm going to do first for my modification is to remove these little tiny surface mount resistors off the TMS-RGB board, and then I'm going to end up just using some solder to just bridge across the pads that are left behind. Or if I had them, you could also just use some 0 ohm resistors as well. Another thing that you need to do, or at least it's highly advisable, I've already done it on this one, so I don't know how much you'll be able to tell that I've done this or not. But it's advisable to insulate the bottom of the board with some tape of some sort. Now I've actually just used some Kapton tape that I already have on hand. In fact, I've got this fairly skinny roll of about 1/2 inch that I have on hand, and it's almost exactly perfect for what I needed. So I just tore off a section of this and cut it to match and stuck it on the back of the board to help isolate and insulate the board itself from the Colecovision PCB when it gets soldered on there. So that's another thing that is highly advisable. So first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and get started on getting these resistors off of here, and that'll be a lot of fun. So let's get to it. Now, one of the simplest ways to remove small surface mount resistors like this on a board is actually to just take your soldering iron, like I have it here, and I've got a fairly decent sized chisel tip on this. Put just a tiny little bit of solder on the end of it, like I'm going to do here, okay? And then, very carefully, kind of touch the ends of the pins, or the ends of the connections. Looks like I'm going to actually need a little more solder on this. But just move the solder back and forth. Oh, there we go, I got it off. If you move it back and forth enough, you'll eventually get the surface mount resistor off of there. And then let me just get it pulled off my iron here, kind of set it down. So there's one. Now we're going to work on getting this next one off of here. Okay, got that one. This one's being a little bit of a booger, so I'm going to grab my tweezers. There we go. Got a big old glop of solder on there. I'm going to need to there we go. Set that down off to the side. I mean, I do need them to be bridged, but I'd rather they not look quite like that when I do it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get some desoldering, or I'm going to get my desoldering braid, and I'm going to get a little bit of flux, maybe a lot of flux. I'm going to go ahead and try to clean these pins up just a little bit. Okay, there we are. So these little guys are off the board. There we are. I was able to get my solder across those old jumper locations, or across those pads, to basically create a 0 ohm bridge across each one. And then I went ahead and tinned up the output pads as well, just to prepare them for wire attachment also. And that's really the only preparation work that's needed on the TMS-RGB itself. The next part of the installation is going to be to attach the TMS-RGB board itself where it needs to go onto the bottom of the Colecovision. We're now looking at the bottom of the Colecovision main PCB board, and the area that we want to focus on is right in this area right here. This is where the main TMS 9929 or 20A chip resides. Now, I can tell this because it's the one on here that's got the big heatsink on it. So yeah, all that's really required is to take this little guy, this little TMS-RGB board, and just solder it to the bottom of the main video processor chip. But the orientation is important. So as you can see here from the Colecovision, we've got the connector pins, or the expansion port pins, down here at the bottom. And with this board sitting in place, you want to make sure that your output lines on the TMS-RGB are pointing out towards the controller ports. That's pretty much the easiest way to remember this. Make sure that the output port, or the output lines, are facing towards the controller ports. So the actual board itself installs with the flat side facing against the flattest portion of the Colecovision RGB, or the Colecovision mainboard itself. And all you have to do is just line up your little pins like that, so that the board just kind of rests and sits in place like that. Now I've noticed that this one's got a little bit of a wiggle to it. because apparently some of the solder beads on the bottom of this board are a little thick. So what I might do is maybe add a little bit of solder to this and maybe try to flatten this section out a little bit. All right, and now that section of the board is considerably flatter so that the RGB board should fit just about flush in there. Oh yeah, that's going to work very nicely. So at this point, it's a pretty simple matter. Now you could go ahead and attach whatever output wires you plan to use. You could go ahead and attach those off of the board at this time. It really doesn't matter at what point. The official instructions will have you do this before you install it, but I'd prefer to go ahead and get the board installed and mounted in place first, and then I can trim up and cut these up. And in fact, because of where I plan to put the AV out connector on this particular Colecovision, I'm actually going to end up installing it with the wires going backwards across the board like that. It's just a shorter run and a shorter distance. So that's what I'll end up doing. So for right now, what I need to do is I just need to get this installed. And there's only a few solder points. You can actually see them pretty easily. They're pretty well marked, where you can see the copper come through on the points that need to be soldered. There's really not that many that are here. So I'm just going to apply a tiny bit of flux on these areas, like that. Then I'm going to get my iron ready. And I'll probably start with this one about in the centers first. Again, no real particular reason why, just seems convenient. That's it. Everything's soldered on. Again, there's only just a few points that you have to solder on. That's what makes this RGB solution such a nice one. And then, as always, I'll clean up a little bit where I've soldered onto place, or where I've soldered the board into place here. Just get some of my flux off of there, just get it cleaned up. Looking good, and it's sitting really flush to the board too. So now at this point, what I need to do, really all I need to do, is just to get my output wires trimmed up and solder those into place. And again, I'm only going to need about 5 wires off of this. Again, I have the ground here, but I don't really need it because the AV connector that I'm using is actually going to be attached to some of the ground plane itself on the main board. So we'll have plenty of ground. So again, I'm just going to be soldering in the 5 volt, the red, the green, the blue, and the sink. And for that, I'm only going to need just the 5 wires for that. So, you know, which color and which wires you use doesn't really matter. Let's see, I usually like to use red for anything that's got voltage, so maybe I'll use this color instead. But, you know, as long as you're using different colors so that you know what goes to where. Or, if you want, you could use the same colors if you really want to. The important thing, again, is just, you know, pay attention to what wires are going to what so that you don't get confused. So I'm going to go ahead and strip back and cut some of this and solder it into place where I need to onto this. All right, I've now got my output wires soldered in place where I want them to go. So from here, all I need to do is I'll need to run them back around through the other side of the board here and connect them up to the connector on the other side, which I haven't installed yet. Additionally, because of the fact that this is installed the way it is and that there's still going to be a bottom RF shield, I'm also going to have to cut out a notch in the RF shield to accommodate for this wire to easily pass through. Because I am using this 9-pin connection, the actual wires from the RGB board that I'm going to wire up is going to pretty much be everything on it with the exception of the ground wire. And that's because honestly, the way that I'm going to install this and the way that these connectors work, the ground is actually the whole metal casing, so I just need to make sure that the metal casing itself has a ground connection to it. The Genesis and Megadrive 2 AV cables use the outer edge or the outer portion of the connector as that ground. So yeah, it'll work really well for that. So I don't have to really worry about a dedicated ground wire to this. You'll see why whenever I get further into the install. But I will need to have the dedicated lines for the red, the green, the blue. I'm going to go ahead and wire in the sync as well as my 5 volts, and then on the audio portion of it, because the Colecovision is a mono audio system, meaning only one channel of audio basically, I'm actually going to wire it to both the mono input line that's dedicated on these Megadrive 2 Genesis 2 AV connectors, and also to the left and right in a dual mono fashion. So I'm actually going to attach the audio wire to 3 separate points on this, just to make sure I've got everything connected and covered for any cables that someone might use as far as audio goes. Let's talk about the output connector itself. Where am I going to place it? Well, ideally, because I'm going to be using this Genesis / Megadrive Model 2 AV out connector, the whole outer casing on this is the ground. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scrape away the solder mask all in this area here and expose the copper ground plane that exists. And what I'll end up doing is I'll end up soldering this connector upside down, basically like that, as straight as I possibly can. Won't be too big a deal. Another good place to solder this to, if you're okay with at least not using the screw to hold down the board and the RF modulator or the RF shield in this corner, is right here as well, because you can actually, this whole section is one ground plane and you can just scrape all of this solder mask away off the top of it, all the varnish off the top of it, solder the connector that way as well. That's how I have it on my personal Colecovision. I'm going to go ahead and get this solder mask scraped away and at least get this connector soldered onto the board. Now, before I do this, I am going to use an additional tool here. I've got a little fiberglass pencil type thing. It's more like a marker size really, but this is excellent for scraping away that varnish and that top solder mask so that I can actually access the copper underneath. And again, I'm just going to kind of make a little square section. In fact, I'm going to get the connector back out again, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of use this tool here, this boring tool as it's called, and I'm going to use it to score along the sides here, roughly where I want this connector to go. So I'm going to have a fairly large section all in here to scrape away to get to it. Now you may have noticed I've got a paper towel under this. The reason is because this is a fiberglass pencil, and so it's going to leave a lot of shards of fiberglass behind, and this is just an easy way for me to collect it. So the way this works is I just literally just kind of push down on the board and just kind of scrape back and forth. And I actually want to overlap a little bit where I'm scraping because I'm going to have to solder it. I'm not going to solder it perfectly on there. I need some extra overlap for that solder to adhere to along the sides. So I'm actually going to follow along my scoring marks here. Now I've been at this for a little bit and you can see already the copper starting to shine through. And then again, I'm just going to kind of tap this on here. You can see that green powder that's left behind. That's the substrate and the varnish coming off the top of the PCB. I'm also taking care to not breathe as much as possible. I don't want to blow this stuff around. It's very finite, it's very thin, it is fiberglass. So it wouldn't be a bad idea to also possibly be wearing a mask while you do this. And then to kind of clean this board up a little bit, I'm just going to get out some Q-tips. cotton swab, Q-tips, whatever you want to use. Get a couple of these out. Get my alcohol once again. And rub along on the board where I was scraping it away. There we go. Got a nice area that I've scraped off, ready to be used. Then I'll get my connector here, kind of line it up where I wanted it to go, make sure I got plenty of areas to solder to and cover it with, and I do indeed. Looks like it's going to work pretty well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn the temperature up on my iron quite a bit. Because this is a large ground plane, it's going to absorb a lot of heat. I'm probably going to have to turn my iron up almost, not quite to max, but I'm probably going to have to set it up to about, that's probably about 850 Celsius. So very, very hot. But again, this is to make sure that I can hold this connector in place. It's also going to be very, very warm when I try to do this. So what I'm going to do is just kind of lightly hold on to it on one side. And what I'll do is I'll get the back, or try to get one side soldered on first, and then I'll focus on the other side. I'm also going to want a lot of flux on this. There we are. I've got that connector soldered on, nice and secure to the ground plane on the board. It's not likely to go anywhere anytime soon. Because of the amount of heat I used and because of all the solder I used, there was way more solder that I used than what you actually see around the edges. So where did the rest of it go? It actually seeps in underneath the connector and the main ground plane on the PCB. So it's also secured along on the bottom as well, in addition to all the sides. So yeah, looking good. Give it a little more cleanup here because I used a lot of flux on that. Okay, I now have the main board back into the lower case shell of the Colecovision because there's a couple of things I need to do at this point. For one, I need to figure out where my wires come out here that's attached to the TMS-RGB and will eventually be looping back around up to here to connect to the actual new AV out connector that's been soldered on here. The other thing I need to do is I need to mark on the back side of the board where the connector is so that I know where to drill my hole through the case, roughly centered on the connector, so that whenever, because it is recessed into the case, I have to make sure that the hole that I drill in the back is wide enough to accommodate the actual connector itself as well as the insulated rubber jacket around it. So that's not really too hard to do. I kind of found the perfect size. It's basically the same size. You need at least a ½ inch, a little larger than a ½ inch hole that you're going to have to put in place for that. So how do I center all this up? How do I make it look good? Or how do I make sure it's about where it needs to be? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use some of the screws from the main board, and I'm going to reattach this back down into place. Now the reason for this is because I want this to be sitting where it's going to sit when it's actually installed, because right now it's just in here kind of loose, so it's got a little bit of motion, it's got a little play in it. Don't have to put all the screws back in. I'm just going to put in just a couple here, just enough to get it held into place. Again, I don't want this to shift. Okay, so let's see. For starters, I need to mark out where I need to clip out on the bottom RF shield. Just to be on the safe side, I'm going to go ahead and use now then again, this is actually like a boring tool designed for cleaning out vias on side of a main board, but it's also pretty sharp. So I'm going to use it to just kind of lightly scrape where I need to on the RF shield on the outside so that I know where to cut that. And that's going to be about a 1-inch cut I'm going to make. It doesn't need to be that wide, but I just want to make sure I give myself plenty of room for this. The other thing I need to do is I need to verify, and I'm going to need to mark where my opening on the back needs to go. And the way I do this is pretty simple. Now that I've got the board, or the AV connector in place right here, I'm going to again use my tool here. I'm going to use the thicker side, and I'm just going to put it up next to it, and I'm just going to trace up along the side of this, cutting into the plastic. Scoring into it, actually. I'm not really cutting it, I'm just scoring it. And this is just so I know where the connector is sitting when it's installed on the main board. And then I'm also going to make a fine line here on either side. That's roughly even with the main board itself, so I know where the bottom of it is. And I'm going to do the same thing with the top. I could try and eyeball this, but I'm not real fond of doing that, if I can avoid it. Okay, those are some good score marks I've made on the inside of the case. Now that I've done that, I'm going to take this back out, and I'll show you how we're going to do this. It's really not that scientific. There's no real measurement required by doing it this way, and it seems to work really well for me. And I'm going to remove the main board back out. Here's the bottom RF shield. I'm going to see if my scrape marks are on there, and yes they are. They're not as deep or as large as I would like them, but I can see them. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my tool again, and I'm just going to go ahead and make those a little bit more noticeable. Now, how am I going to cut this, you might be asking yourself. Well, there is a tool I use for this. You could actually use just some wire cutters if they're strong enough to be able to get in there and kind of crease it, and then you should be able to take the metal or take a pair of pliers and be able to wiggle it and bend it back and forth to break it loose. I'm going to do something similar, except that instead of using wire cutters, I actually have some tin snips that I use for this. And I don't have them here, they're out in my garage, but that's how I'll remove that section of the RF, or the bottom RF shield, to allow for the cable to come through. Now let's talk about the case itself. So right here is where I scored the outline of the new connector. So all I'm going to have to do from here, now that I've got that kind of marked into place, is I just need to find the center of it. Well, since it happens to be a square connector, that's not very difficult at all. So what I did was I scored out even deeper and just made an X by connecting the corners of the box that I made an outline for. And basically right here in the center of that X is where I'm going to drill my pilot hole that I'm then going to enlarge in with like a half size, or with a 1/2 inch Forstner bit in this case, to get the opening I need to be able to put a cable in and attach it to the new connector. So I'm going to go off camera here for a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and get the RF shield trimmed up, and I'm going to get this hole made, and I'll be right back. I've made the necessary modifications to the case shell, but I've actually got that cleaning and drying at the moment. So while we're waiting on that, I wanted to show you some additional work I did on the actual AV out jack itself. Here I've got a little small breakout board that attaches to this 9-pin mini DIN that's used on the Model 2 Genesis and Megadrive. And actually you can get these, I believe, from Osh Park. I'll see if I can find the link to it again, and I'll include it in the video descriptor. But what I've done is I've taken the ground tabs from off of the connector, and I've folded them over flat along the edge and the openings of this breakout board. And then I kind of clip the edges of them flush with the edge of the PCB, and of course I solder them down into place. And then there's also some little front tabs on the front, some little tabs on the front of the AV jack. I just fold those over towards the front of it as much as I can, and then the same thing, I just apply some solder in place to fill in the hole, and also along the front as well to secure it in place. Then you'll also notice that I've got a couple of wires already soldered to this AV out jack. The first one is the audio wire. The easiest place to grab audio on the Colecovision especially where I have this AV jack mounted, is off of the leg closest to the RF modulator off of capacitor C88. It's this little ceramic disc capacitor right here. And all you have to do is just run one wire from that and connect it to all three of the inputs on the breakout board for mono, right, and left. Again, the Colecovision is just a monaural or mono output device. So by connecting it to all three, you can be sure that any cable you attach to this that's compatible with the Genesis 2 and Megadrive 2 AV out port should be able to receive audio on all channels. The other cable that I've connected up here is the one for the composite video input. It's actually marked on the board. It's very tiny, but it says CVid, which just means composite video. And I've got a composite modification board already installed from the previous video I did right here. And I just have the video output line from that running all the way over back to the breakout port here. So the other lines that are left to connect will actually come off of this ribbon cable. And they'll connect to the green, the red, the blue, the sync, and the 5 volts. Some devices require the 5 volts. Some SCART switchers require the 5 volts so that they can detect that there's a signal that's been supplied and switch over to it. So that's the primary reason for that. Additionally, some conversion cables like the RAD2X cables, which I believe are compatible with this, probably also require the 5 volt power line to power their internal components. So yeah, really what's left to do while I'm waiting on the case is just to get this wire folded over and clip it where I need to and solder it into place. Now you'll remember before when I talked about the RF shields also requiring some modifications to allow my wiring to go through. Well, that's all been done on the side here. You can see that I've cut myself, I didn't cut myself, but I have cut roughly about a 1-inch wide opening square on both part of the bottom RF shield as well as on the top RF shield. And this is just to allow my ribbon cable from underneath from the TMS-RGB board to be able to pass through easily and cleanly. Now these edges are a tiny bit sharp still, so what I'm going to probably do, and I'm honestly not that worried because the cable's a lot smaller than this opening, but just to be on the safe side, I'll probably apply some Kapton tape around the edges of this just as an additional insulation, just to prevent any edges or anything from being a problem. The other modification I had to do is actually on the back side of the RF shield, and it was just on the top section. I had to make sure that I gave myself enough opening to be able to accommodate the new AV out jack, because of course that's going to poke through a little bit. So yeah, just a couple things to be aware of. You will have to do some modification possibly to the RF shield. Real quickly before I finalize up my wiring here, there's one more component on the main board that needs to be removed just to ensure you have a clean video signal coming out of the RGB board. And that is this inductor right here marked as L9 on the board. So what you need to do is you need to remove this inductor and then you need to jumper across either with a piece of wire or perhaps with a piece of cut lead. So I'm going to take care of that right now. Now with that inductor removed and jumpered across, I'm ready to go ahead and solder in the rest of my wiring for the RGB board to the AV out jack. There we go, all wired up, ready to basically reassemble it back into the case and test it out.